Okay, hello and welcome to the first video in week 8 of ADMS 1010, exploring the functions of business. And this week we'll be talking about value chains, and in this video we'll be talking about productivity. So first, a quick look at the agenda. We're going to start by talking about value chains, and then we're going to move on to discuss productivity and how it's changed over the course of the 20th century, especially the impact of globalization. Then we're going to look quickly at the reading, the Margera reading with the interview with Victor Fung, Li Fung, and then lastly we'll conclude by looking at the Plantations reading. So I'd like to start this video by noting the following point. Organizations are open systems. This observation harkens back to our earlier discussion of business's place in the world. If you recall then, we outlined 3 different perspectives on that relationship. The classic or disparate view, the intertwined view, and lastly the embedded view. Now, the claim that business is an open system is not necessarily incompatible with any of these 3 perspectives. Basically, the alternative perspective is that business would be a closed system, meaning that it would be fully self-contained and self-sufficient. Now, even the most ardent defender of the disparate view would likely admit that business cannot continue to function without some give and take from society and the environment. Nevertheless, it helps to state the claim that business is an open system. Open systems interact and rely on the environment around them. Thinking of business as an open system with flows of inputs and outputs to and from the environment, over distances and between different actors, all working toward the creation of value, thus gets us toward the value chain of business, or in other words, the supply chain. A value chain can be defined as the process by which a valuable product or service is created. As it's now extremely rare, if not impossible, for any given business to conduct this process entirely by itself, we are naturally drawn to considering the process of value creation as connecting many different actors, places, and things together. Let's take a quick look at a concept map representation of a value chain. Basically, we start with an input, which then undergoes a transformation process. And then it becomes output. The neoclassical perspective on production notes 3 key inputs: land, labor, and capital. The transformation process is the part where business's production takes place. Value is added through the interactions of the inputs, and the result is the production of a good or service. And we can see that this process can and should be characterized as an open system, flowing from the environment, through the organization, and back into the environment. Now let's look a little bit closer at the production process. What principles govern this process, and what potential is there for improving it? Well, in the early 20th century, the prevailing approach to answering these questions was known as scientific management, a school of thinking about production and operations associated in particular with the work of Frederick Taylor, aka Taylorism. Scientific management heavily emphasized the application of scientific methods to improve management and production. Production processes could be studied and made explicit or understandable as a series of discrete actions, and fine-tuned or improved. One way to do this was by conducting a time-motion study, which is essentially observing production process and timing discrete actions with a stopwatch to establish standards for production efficiency, around which compensation could then be determined. The major goal of scientific management was, accordingly, efficiency, improving the amount of output produced as a ratio to the amount of inputs, labor time in particular, used to create it. Though this school was popular in the very early 20th century, its somewhat condescending approach to human resources eventually led it to be replaced with alternative perspectives by mid-century. Nevertheless, we still see many aspects and principles of this perspective on production and operations management in the study of those activities today. The early 20th century also saw the advent of Fordism, an organization of the industrial process pioneered by Henry Ford. Fordism was characterized by 3 main principles: standardization, basically ensuring that products were all produced according to the same specifications and standards. And this was a lot easier to achieve as automation of the production processes were beginning to pick up speed in the early 20th century. Assembly lines were another important component, Echoing scientific management, the principle here is that the production process would be divided into its more minute tasks, and each worker would be responsible for only one task. And lastly, Fordism was characterized by higher wages, under the thinking that workers could then afford to purchase the products that they were making. Fordism characterized much of the 20th century for the industrial world, ushering in an era of mass-produced, widely available, and affordable consumer goods built by well-paid and often unionized workers. And it wasn't until the late 20th century that this model began to break down and the developed world entered the current post-Fordism era. One of the key drivers for the breakdown of the Fordist approach to economic production was globalization, meaning the increasing economic integration and interdependence of national, regional, and local economies across the world through an intensification of cross-border movement of goods, services, technologies, and capital. As part of the neoliberal economic movement we talked about in week 6, many countries began to pursue bilateral, multilateral, and global free trade agreements in the late 20th century. This shift represented a dramatic reversal from past thinking on trade and development, which often allowed for a greater degree of protectionism to help a country build its own manufacturing and industrial sectors. This was the time of prominent national corporations, where the economic health of the nation was closely tied to the performance of those companies. But as trade and other barriers began to recede, these companies were no longer bound by the protective barriers of their home countries. The production process was increasingly something that could take place across national borders, organized and managed by even larger, multinational corporations. This week's reading by Joan Margretta, in which she interviews Victor Fung, chairman of Li Fung, looks at supply chain management in the era of globalization. As you can see from this definition, Li Fung is a Hong Kong-based firm specializing in supply chain management. Well, what does this entail? As we find in the interview, Li Fung excel in managing dispersed manufacturing, an approach to production characterized by breaking up the value chain and rationalizing each component, almost like scientific management applied at a global scale. This means, in effect, that Li Fung can create customized value chains for each of their customers, and thus can tailor the production process to meet their customers' needs. But it is more than simply linking up suppliers with buyers. Fung describes the company as a smokeless factory, where Li Fung provide a lot of management services for the supply chain, including quality control and engineering. But they don't own the factories, and they don't manage the workers in the traditional sense. How do they accomplish all this? Well, the company is structured around divisions, and as much as possible, they devote an entire division solely to one client. These divisions are headed by what Fung terms Little John Waynes. The image is supposed to indicate that the divisions are headed by autonomous and entrepreneurial people running the division like they would run their own country. In fact, Fung notes that they often hire people to run the divisions who would otherwise be running their own companies. And they manage to keep them there with substantial financial incentives. However, there's some aspects of the business that are not autonomous and entrepreneurial. In these areas, Li Fung centralize administration and manage tightly. These are in the areas of financial controls and operating procedures. Ultimately, the business is to a large extent based on trust. As Fung notes, to manage the whole supply chain, you need to have the trust of your supply network so that you can lock down capacity or resources in advance of actually having a definite work plan or order. This diagram from the readings summarizes how Li Fung add value. As you can see, a number of higher-end functions are still provided by the firm, while raw materials and other inputs are managed through the vast network of suppliers. Shifting gears, let's look at the other assigned reading this week, this time an interview with Caitlin Rosenthal about her work on labor management practices and slaveholding plantations in the southern U.S. in the early 19th century. And if you don't know, plantations were large agricultural operations specializing in crop production for crops like cotton and sugarcane. And these farms relied relied extensively on slave labor. The interesting thing about Rosenthal's research, though it is very dehumanizing, or at least it shows how dehumanizing slavery was, is that it seems to indicate that slave owners practiced scientific management over 100 years before Taylor. Partly because slaves couldn't leave or quit, owners focused more on optimizing their production process. And this entailed the use of advanced accounting techniques, very similar to contemporary ones, such as the depreciation of slaves, mark-to-market accounting, or accounting for the value of an asset, slaves in this case, based on current market values. And they even had an ideal unit to measure workers' productivity by, the prime field hand. So what are the implications? Well, for one, slavery was good for business. Plantation agriculture was, up to about the U.S. Civil War starting in 1861, the biggest contributor to the U.S. national economy, but it was built upon a repressive, dehumanizing production process. That brings us to the second point. A strong focus on production efficiencies can go hand in hand with dehumanizing labor practices. Now, for this week's assignment, you were asked to evaluate the persuasiveness of both the Margretta and Rosenthal articles using the concepts provided in Dyer's textbook, Chapter 6. What were those concepts? Well, first, you can anticipate and counter readers' objections. Second, you should be discussing negative evidence if you would like to be persuasive. And if applicable, you should note and discuss rival causes to your claim. Persuasiveness also entails anticipating challenges to underlying assumptions and also limiting claims if you cannot think of a rebuttal to potential objections. And lastly, persuasiveness involves making effective use of rhetoric, which includes using an appropriate tone for the article, being complete in your presentation of the matter, and using vivid and non-vague language. So obviously the first step before engaging in this exercise is to consider the primary claims of either article. Once you've done that, you can proceed to assess who is more persuasive. The Margretta interview with Victor Fung, explaining how Li and Fung have prospered in the era of globalization, or the interview with Rosenthal, explaining her work on accounting practices in early slaveholding plantations. Now, because you're arguing for what you find most persuasive, there is, in a way, no wrong answer here. But you would have needed to provide a comprehensive discussion of your preferences using the criteria in Dyer's textbook.